Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello, fantasy fiction fans! So, mid-September brings us the first taste of autumn and the reminder that all things must die. Mid-September is a time to reflect on the transience of life, when the leaves have fallen and the crops cease their growing cycle. But it is also a time of mild fertility and a few warmer days. For example, here in England as I speak, it's quite warm. But we had some cool days last week, some very cool days. First thing in the morning you could see your breath. So autumn is a time of induction, and what I mean by that is it's a time of preparation for the darkness of winter, and it's a time of transformation because we're moving from warmth and light into the dark days that winter will bring. The ancient Greeks and later the Romans had a Titan deity who was the goddess of boundaries and the goddess of crossroads, and her name was Hecate. She was a three-formed or triple-bodied goddess. And what I mean by that is that she had three heads, and her image was commonly used at crossroads and at some entrances to temples and even luxurious private homes. "Look at Hecate," said the 1st century Roman poet Ovid, "standing guard at the crossroads, one face looking in each direction." And she embodies three characters: Hecate, the light bringer, Hecate, the person of the night, and Hecate Basilia, the queen of the underworld. Dogs, and especially feral dogs, have long been associated with Hecate, and in art she is often seen as a dog, or she's found or portrayed near a dog. Her approach is said to be heralded by a dog howl. The yew tree, Y-E-W, which is known in Latin as taxus, and which is where we get the words tax and also toxic from, is a tree that is sacred to Hecate. In England, yews grew in churchyards, well they still do grow in churchyards. And the reason for this is that the branches were used to make bows, i.e. in bows and arrows, that type of bow, but they have to be grown inside a walled garden because the berries are highly toxic. So the history is that they would grow in a churchyard because it was open space, it was common to all, everybody could go and cut themselves a branch. It wasn't a private piece of land, but it was walled. And the berries of a taxus, the yew tree, are highly toxic, and their branches must be kept away from cattle for that reason. And that's why we often associate yew trees with churchyards, and why they're sometimes regarded as graveyard trees. And this brings us back to Hecate's role as a goddess of boundaries, because like yew trees, she lives outside our walls, but she lives at the doorways and entrances to realms that lie outside the world of the living. And she's a goddess of betweenness, or as you should call it, liminality. And if you're interested in liminality and the liminal world, I've written in much greater detail on the subject and talked about the subtle period of liminality and why you must use it in your fantasy fiction, and that's in my new non-fiction book, So You Want to Write Fantasy. But going back to her role as a goddess of liminality and crossroads, Hecate has 3 heads. So she offers a way forward, or a way left, or a way right. She does not offer the return journey. You can never go back. So you can go straight on at your crossroads, or right or left. The bravest way is straight ahead, and that's because there's no chance to deviate from that route. For those who are less desperate or heroic, it's perhaps best to turn left. So, for example, if you enter a church or large temple, to go straight forwards will bring you directly before the face of God at his altar. But if you go left, you'll learn more about yourself before you eventually meet your maker. So it's for those who are less desperate or less heroic. Hecate's association with boundaries and with liminal space, such as crossroads and graveyards, means that she's strongly associated with ghosts and also travel into the underworld. And so therefore on 16th of September, her memory is recalled in what is known as the Hecate Supper. So celebrants will hold their Hecate suppers in honour of the triple goddess at this time of early liminality, because we are between one season, summer, and the next season, winter. We are at a time of liminality, a time of light, but also a time of dark. This is a time where we are speculating on what the future will bring, and we're remembering with some fondness what happened just a few weeks ago in the summer. The supper, the Hecate supper, is to be consumed outside, in the dark, preferably in moonlight, but you can't be sure what the weather's going to be on the 16th of September, but ideally at a crossroads. And you will eat and consume your supper, but a plate is reserved for Hecate, and it's left at the crossroads. And in the morning, if you return to the plate, magically the plate will have been emptied of food and it will have been licked clean. Now, of course, it's not difficult to speculate that the plate had been cleaned by roving foxes and feral cats and dogs, and perhaps even other nighttime animals. But that's okay, because that was Hecate's intent all along. It is one of the several ways that she accepts her offerings that are made to her. Traditionally, anything that is given to Hecate cannot be reclaimed. You cannot go back. You can only go forward, left or right. So it's best not to use your best crockery. You can't collect your plate afterwards. It must be left there. And after the supper, during the night, it's best not to look back. Once you've laid your dish, never return to the dish until it's light again, because that dish is, once it's been left there, is for Hecate. Hecate will determine herself who picks up those offerings, and you can only go forwards. You cannot go back. It's your choice, but you cannot go back. The Hecate Supper. So we adore fantasy, don't we? And let's be honest, fantasy is the best-selling genre of all time. There's no doubt about that. But there are people out there who hate fantasy titles. Yes, it's true. It's hard to believe, huh? But even I have my reservations. For example, I have never been drawn to the Toy Story series, or the Shrek series, or even the Despicable Me series. I've never seen any of those. I probably never will. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but why? Why, Neil? You'd love them. Well, perhaps I would, but I've never been drawn to them. And it's the same with the Clash of the Titans and How to Train Your Dragon. I don't know anything about those. I'm not interested in looking into them, and I'll be perfectly frank with you, Even the concept and the idea of them begins to bore me. And don't even get me started on the Iron Man franchise. Now, you obviously can't miss the Iron Man franchise, it's there in your face, but to me it is an ultimate piece of tedium. So what is it about fantasy titles that turns people away from the genre? What is it about fantasy that drives people off? So I did a little research and I discovered 20 things that fantasy haters don't like about our genre. And what can authors learn from this? Well, maybe we can ration some of the worst stylistic elements and the most boring features of fantasy, and maybe we could listen to some of their criticisms and make some adjustments. Or, maybe quite the opposite, perhaps we should load our stories with even more of what they hate. After all, they'll never get it, but our true fans out there will love all those things. So I think either way it's a good thing to understand and know the flip side of opinion. So here are 20 things that people hate about fantasy. Number 1. Too little or too much romance turns people off. It seems that fantasies are unable to bring the comforting balance of just enough romance. Number 2. Some people think that only children are naturally drawn to fantasy worlds, and so fantasy is not for adults. I think this is my problem when we come to Toy Story and Shrek and even Iron Man. For me, those things are for children. Number 3. Some people do not like stories that are told without rules and without limits. Number 4. Some find the language of fantasy somewhat inaccessible. You know what I'm talking about, especially if you like reading Tolkien. Number 5. Some people feel that fantasy fiction does not focus enough on the human experience and human problems. Number 6. Some people don't like stories with too many characters to follow. Number 7. Some people do not like prose with so many fussy details. 8. Some people do not have the imagination to immerse themselves in fantasy worlds. And that's just the way that their minds are hardwired. That's just how they are. Number 9. Some do not feel that their life requires the escapism that fantasy offers. They don't need the escape. 10. Some dislike the flowery prose that you often find in fantasy. They want hard-hitting, punchy, quick, snappy dialogue and quick, punchy description. Number 11. Some dislike the arbitrary power that an author has over a character and or a plot. For example, inconsistent rules or ill-conceived magical systems. Why does the author hold on to that power? Number 12. Some people are unable to or unwilling to invest in the span of the stories that make up an epic fantasy series. I'm like that with the Greek mythology. It's just too much for me. There's too many names, there's too many words, and I'll be frank, there's too many stories in Greek mythology for me to invest in the entire span of it. I don't mind dipping in to the odd bit, but Greek mythology goes on and on and on, and it's the same with some fantasy series. There's just too much of it. Number 13. Some people believe that fantasy fiction is geared towards the male reader. Now, I find this quite interesting because there's so many female readers out there who are devoted to fantasy fiction, but when you think of the biggest selling fantasy titles, for example, Inception, Iron Man, How to Train Your Dragon, Clash of the Titans, they often tend to be male orientated. On the other side of the coin, Harry Potter, Alice in Wonderland, Twilight Saga, these I think possibly would appeal to the female reader. So although there's so many female devoted and dedicated fantasy fans out there, it seems odd that fantasy fiction is often geared towards the male reader. Number 14, skeptics, and that's to say those people who doubt that something is true or useful. Skeptics say that magic is unscientific. They'd like a bit of science. Those same skeptics, they say that magic is unrealistic. And worse still, those skeptics say that magic is not intellectual or sophisticated enough for them. And number 17, recycled tropes are a bore. I kind of agree with this. Let's not have any more tropes. Or let's not have more tropes than we need. Let's not stuff our work with boring tropes. And number 18, for some, the sheer size of a single fantasy novel, just a single fantasy novel, is intimidating. And that's let alone a series. I get it. I think a lot of people got into Tolkien because they enjoyed the size, the brevity, and the completeness of The Hobbit. But taking on the Lord of the Rings trilogy was an entirely different prospect. Number 19, fantasy romance is considered unrealistic. So even if they have got romance in there, and it obviously will be either too much or too little, it will be unrealistic anyway. Oh dear. And lastly, number 20, conventional rules of reality can easily be bent or hot-wired. That's what critics think. Hot-wired. And this is seen as shortcutting. So where a plot should be properly worked out and properly conceived and then scientifically explained, skeptics think that fantasy writers shortcut all of that. And that's unfair, and they don't like unfairness in their fiction. So there you are. 20 things that people hate about fantasy.